There is a photograph that the Spanish royal house did not want the world to see. It was taken sometime in the early 1990s, somewhere along the sun-drenched coast of southern Spain, and it shows a king, a man who embodied the rebirth of an entire nation, living a private life so dramatically at odds with his public image that when the truth finally began to surface, it sent shockwaves through not just a country, but an entire institution stretching back centuries. The Spanish monarchy had survived civil war, dictatorship, and exile. It had survived assassination attempts and political earthquakes. But what it could not survive, what it was never truly prepared for, was the truth. For decades, the Kingdom of Spain presented to the world a royal family that seemed almost too good to be true. King Juan Carlos I was celebrated as a hero of democracy, the man who personally steered his country from the shadow of Francisco Franco's dictatorship into the warm light of a modern constitutional monarchy. He was the king who stood before the cameras during the 1981 coup attempt, dressed in military uniform, and told the entire nation, calm, resolute, unflinching, that the democratic order would hold. The people loved him for it. Europe admired him for it. But behind the gleaming facade of the Zarzuela Palace, behind the carefully managed press releases and the choreographed royal appearances, a very different story was quietly unfolding. And the deeper you go into that story, the harder it becomes to look away. To understand how Spain got here, to understand why these secrets cut so deeply, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to Juan Carlos himself, but to the world that made him. Francisco Franco, the generalissimo who ruled Spain with an iron fist from 1939 until his death in 1975, did not believe in leaving things to chance. He had fought a brutal civil war to seize power, and he had no intention of letting that power simply evaporate after his death. So he did something extraordinary, something that even his own allies found audacious. He personally hand-selected his successor. And that successor was a young prince named Juan Carlos de Bourbon. Juan Carlos was not Franco's obvious choice. He was the grandson of King Alfonso XIII, who had fled Spain in 1931 when the Republic was proclaimed. His own father, Don Juan de Bourbon, was the legitimate heir to the Spanish throne by dynastic right, but Don Juan was too liberal, too independent, too unwilling to simply play the role Franco needed. So Franco reached past the father and selected the son. He brought the young prince to Spain as a teenager, oversaw his education personally, and groomed him with one explicit purpose: to continue the regime. Juan Carlos was trained in military academies, tutored in the arts of governance, and presented to the Spanish people as the future. A future that would, Franco believed, carry the old general's legacy forward indefinitely. What Franco never accounted for was the possibility that the young man he had so carefully cultivated might have a mind entirely his own. When the old dictator finally died in November of 1975 after weeks of agonizing medical interventions that his inner circle prolonged far beyond any reasonable mercy, Juan Carlos I was proclaimed King of Spain. And within months, the country began to realize that something unexpected was happening. The new king was not dismantling democracy. He was building it. Quietly, patiently, and with remarkable political skill, Juan Carlos began steering Spain toward free elections, a new constitution, and a functioning parliamentary system. By the time the dust settled in the early 1980s, Spain had completed one of the most successful democratic transitions in modern history. The king was hailed as its architect. His popularity was stratospheric, and therein lay the problem. When a man becomes a symbol, when he is elevated to the status of something almost sacred in the national consciousness, the gap between the symbol and the man underneath it becomes fertile ground for secrets. And Juan Carlos, it would eventually emerge, had been accumulating secrets for a very long time. The first cracks in the public image appeared slowly, almost imperceptibly. There were whispers about the king's private life, about relationships outside his marriage to Queen Sofia, a Greek princess of impeccable lineage who had stood dutifully beside him through every public triumph and private storm. These whispers were not entirely new. In the tight circles of European aristocracy and the Madrid press corps, certain things were understood but never printed. Spain's media, still finding its footing after decades of censorship, was in some ways culturally unprepared to pursue the kind of investigative journalism that might have brought these stories into the light sooner. And there was something else at work too. A collective desire, almost a need, to protect the symbol. Juan Carlos had given Spain democracy. Surely that counted for something. Surely that bought him a certain privacy, a certain grace. But grace has its limits. And in the autumn of 2012, those limits were reached in the most spectacularly ill-timed fashion imaginable. Spain in 2012 was a nation in agony. The global financial crisis had hit the country with particular brutality. Unemployment had climbed above 25%, above 50% for young people. Families were losing their homes. Hospitals were cutting services. Ordinary Spaniards were lining up at food banks while politicians debated austerity measures that seemed to grind the lives of the poorest citizens into dust. It was against this backdrop, this landscape of national pain, that a photograph emerged from Botswana. The King of Spain, it turned out, had been on a private elephant hunting safari in Africa. He had broken his hip in a fall. And while his country bled economically, while his subjects lined up for bread, Juan Carlos had been in the bush, posing with a dead elephant, accompanied by a German-born businesswoman named Corinna Sayn-Wittgenstein, with whom he was rumored to have a deeply personal relationship. The photograph did not just damage the king's image, it detonated it. The public outrage was immediate and seismic. For the first time in his reign, Juan Carlos was forced to issue a public apology, a brief, almost stunned-sounding statement in which he acknowledged that he had made a mistake and promised it would not happen again. He said sorry, but the apology, rather than closing the wound, seemed only to open it further. Because once the Spanish press and public began asking questions, real questions, uncomfortable questions, they discovered that the elephant safari was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom. What followed over the next several years was a slow, grinding excavation of everything that had been buried beneath the golden mythology of the Spanish crown. And the further investigators dug, the stranger and more troubling the picture became. The name Iñaki Urdangarin entered the Spanish national consciousness like a stone through a window. Urdangarin was a former Olympic handball champion, a genuine Spanish sports hero who had married the king's youngest daughter, Princess Cristina, in 1997. The couple were glamorous, athletic, beloved. They seemed to embody a new kind of royalty for a new, modern Spain. But behind the public-facing charity work and the sports medals, investigators began to uncover something deeply troubling. Urdangarin, through a foundation called the Nóos Institute, was accused of diverting millions of euros in public funds, money granted by regional governments for ostensibly charitable purposes, into private accounts. The amounts were staggering, the alleged methods were brazen, and the paper trail led uncomfortably close to the doors of the palace itself. Princess Cristina was eventually placed under formal investigation for alleged tax fraud, a first in modern Spanish royal history. The image of a king's daughter appearing before a court sent a tremor through the nation that no earthquake could have manufactured. She was ultimately acquitted of the most serious charges, but her husband was convicted and sentenced to prison. The damage to the royal house was profound and lasting. This was not a minor financial irregularity. This was a major criminal prosecution that reached into the heart of the family. And it raised questions that had never been asked aloud before about what exactly was known and by whom and for how long. And still, the story was not finished. Because even as the Urdangarin scandal played out in the courts and on the front pages, another revelation was quietly gathering momentum. This one would prove even more personally devastating to Juan Carlos himself. Corinna Sayn-Wittgenstein, the woman who had been at his side in Botswana, began to speak. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually, in fragments across interviews and legal proceedings in multiple countries, a portrait began to emerge of a relationship that was far more than a simple extramarital affair. Corinna claimed in increasingly detailed and specific terms that she had been a confidant to Juan Carlos for years. She claimed he had shared things with her, private things, financial things that no one in official Spain wanted examined. She alleged that large sums of money had been transferred to her on his behalf. She described a world of private accounts, foreign jurisdictions, and financial arrangements that seemed designed specifically to remain invisible. The figure that would eventually emerge from Swiss and Spanish investigations was almost incomprehensible in its scale. Roughly 65 million euros allegedly transferred to an account in the name of Corinna Sayn-Wittgenstein in 2012. The very same year the Botswana scandal broke, the very same year Spain was convulsed by economic crisis. Swiss authorities opened a money laundering investigation. Spanish prosecutors began their own inquiries. And Juan Carlos, the hero of democracy, the man who had held the line against a coup, found himself at the center of a legal and moral storm that no palace communications team could spin away. There were deeper questions too, ones that reached further back into the past. Investigators and journalists began examining Juan Carlos's financial dealings over the course of decades, looking at his relationships with Gulf state monarchies, at commissions allegedly received in connection with major infrastructure contracts, at a world of offshore accounts and discrete intermediaries that seemed to exist entirely parallel to his official life as a constitutional monarch. The full picture remains, even now, only partially visible. Some documents remain sealed, some witnesses remain silent. Some jurisdictions have moved faster than others. But what was visible was already enough to rewrite the history of modern Spain. In August of 2020, Juan Carlos I left Spain. He departed without a formal public announcement. A brief letter to his son, now King Felipe VI, informed the public that he was leaving, that he wanted to remove himself from the public stage so that his personal matters would not cast a shadow over the institution his son was trying to lead. He settled in Abu Dhabi. The palace confirmed that he had left. It did not say when or whether he would return. The departure of a former king is not a small thing. It is not the kind of event that a country processes quickly or easily. For many Spaniards, particularly those of a certain generation, those who had lived through the Franco years and who remembered with vivid clarity what it had meant when Juan Carlos stood firm in 1981, the exile of their former king felt like grief, like losing something that could not be replaced, like watching a story they had believed in collapse under its own weight. For others, and their numbers grew steadily, the departure was long overdue. These were Spaniards who had grown up in a democracy, who had no personal memory of the dictatorship, who looked at the financial investigations and the private safaris and the secret accounts and the convicted son-in-law and saw not a fallen hero, but an institution that had believed for too long that it was above accountability. Republican sentiment in Spain, always present but long marginal, began to rise. Polls showed declining support for the monarchy among younger generations. The conversation that had once been considered almost taboo, should Spain even have a king, was now being held openly in universities and newspaper columns and on social media without embarrassment. King Felipe VI, who had ascended to the throne in 2014 after his father's abdication, found himself navigating an almost impossible inheritance. He was not his father, he had not made his father's choices, but he wore the same crown, and in the public imagination, the sins of the father cast long shadows. Felipe moved to publicly renounce his inheritance from Juan Carlos, stripping himself of any financial benefits tied to his father's name. The palace announced that Juan Carlos's royal allowance was being suspended. These were not merely symbolic gestures, they were attempts to draw a clear line, to say that this new chapter of the monarchy would be built on different foundations. Whether those foundations will hold is, as of this writing, an open question. What is not in question is what the secrets of the Spanish crown have revealed about something much larger than one family or one institution. They have revealed the way in which mythologies, national mythologies, royal mythologies, the stories that nations tell about themselves can become prisons. The story of Juan Carlos was so powerful, so necessary to Spain's sense of itself, that for decades it crowded out inconvenient truths. The press was reluctant to challenge it. The political class was reluctant to examine it. The public was reluctant to hear it. And in that space of collective reluctance, secrets grew. The story of royal scandal is, of course, as old as royalty itself. Every dynasty in human history has had its hidden rooms, its inconvenient truths, its members who behaved in ways that flatly contradicted the divine or civil mandate under which they claimed to rule. What makes the Spanish case distinctly modern, distinctly of this moment, is the speed and totality with which the revelation arrived. In an earlier era, much of what emerged about Juan Carlos might never have reached the public at all. The mechanisms of concealment, financial secrecy, a deferential press, the natural reticence of those who depended on royal favor had worked for generations. What changed was not the behavior. What changed was the world around it. Swiss banking secrecy eroded. International financial transparency initiatives created new windows into accounts that had once been invisible. Investigative journalism, operating across borders and answering to no single government, proved harder to suppress than the domestic press had been. The woman who had been at the center of his private world began, for her own complex reasons, to speak. And once the silence breaks, once the first thread is pulled, the unraveling has a momentum of its own. Juan Carlos returned briefly to Spain in 2022, and again in 2023, visits that were precisely calibrated for emotional impact, heavy with the imagery of a prodigal return. He was photographed with his grandchildren. He attended sailing regattas. He smiled for cameras. Spanish prosecutors ultimately closed their investigation of him in 2022 without charges, citing immunity provisions related to his period as a reigning monarch. In Switzerland, an investigation was also closed. For his supporters, these closures represented vindication. For his critics, they represented the continuation of a very old story, that those at the top of the pyramid find ways, in the end, to remain there. But the palace has changed. Whether that change is cosmetic or fundamental is something only time will reveal. Felipe VI has worked to project an image of transparency and restraint, releasing detailed financial accounts, accepting a lower budget, submitting to a level of scrutiny that his father never faced. The institution is adapting, as institutions must. Whether adaptation is enough, in an era that has less and less patience for inherited privilege and institutional secrecy, remains the defining question of the modern Spanish monarchy. What cannot be changed is the past. The secrets that Spain tried to hide are part of the record now, not a footnote, but a central chapter in the story of one of Europe's oldest and most storied royal houses. They tell us something about power and its discontents, about the price of mythology, about what happens when the distance between the story a nation tells about itself and the reality underneath it becomes too great to sustain. There was a moment, in the weeks after the Botswana photograph surfaced, when a journalist asked a Spanish schoolgirl what she thought about the king. She was perhaps 12 or 13 years old. She had grown up in a democratic Spain, had never known anything else, had no memory of the coup attempt or the transition. She looked at the camera and said simply that she thought it was unfair. Not the safari exactly, but the idea that some people got to live by different rules. She was not talking about politics. She was not making a Republican argument. She was saying something simpler, and perhaps more powerful, that fairness matters. That the distance between what people are told and what is actually true has consequences. That secrets eventually always cost more than the truth would have. The Zarzuela Palace still stands outside Madrid, elegant and discreet behind its walls and its trees. A king still lives there, working through the daily rituals of constitutional monarchy, attending to state business, signing documents, hosting foreign dignitaries. The institution endures, but the story around it is different now, more complicated, more contested, more honest, perhaps, in its complexity. And somewhere in Abu Dhabi, an old man lives quietly, far from the country he shaped and the country that, in the end, shaped him in ways he never quite anticipated. The hero of the transition. The symbol of the new Spain. The man whose secrets, when they finally came to light, reminded the world that no one, not even a king, is purely the story that is told about them. History does not deal in simple verdicts. Juan Carlos's role in Spain's democratic transition was real, consequential, and genuinely courageous in ways that no subsequent scandal can entirely erase. But history also does not deal in selective memory. The full picture is always more complicated than the monument, always more human, always, in the end, more true. That is the story Spain tried to hide. And it is, like all the best and most important stories, still unfinished.